Let's see what you got.
This is an exploration of the documentary interview process.
Okay.
This is a talking head interview under the microscope. So when we first met, which I'm going to estimate at about 2005.
That sounds about right.
About
2004, 2005, somewhere in there.
So about a decade.
Yeah, give or take, a little bit over.
Okay. When we first met, the first thing that I noted about you is that A, you struck me as somebody with a lot of interesting stories to tell.
I've seen some things.
And
Some
B,
things that can't be taken back.
you struck me as someone, and you just reinforced this, that knows that you have a lot of interesting stories to tell. One might say that you deal or traffic in stories. You've also worked in film for how many years?
I guess 10 years now as well.
Okay, so basically we've been friends for the entirety of your professional experience.
Pretty much.
And during that time, we have collaborated on multiple documentary projects in the director and cinematographer relationship capacity.
Sure.
Do you remember what the first one was?
I forget what it was called. It was about gangs.
Leave Out Violence.
Leave out violence.
Yeah.
Well, okay, yeah, I remember that vaguely.
So that was the first time. If I decide to use any B-roll, I can throw up a picture that's been on Facebook for a decade now of...
Okay.
Again, when we first met, you had recently moved back from living in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, the first, 100 times that I hung out with you were largely colored by being regaled with stories of living in Ukraine.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Now, eventually where I want to lead with this is how that experience colored you as a filmmaker and, the way you might conduct yourself in your craft. But before we get to that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to encourage you to tell me 3 short stories from your experience of living there.
Okay. Let's give me a second to think. It's pretty common in Ukraine for people to pee in public. People do it everywhere all the time. And once you're living there, you sort of start thinking when in Rome and you start doing it yourself. I remember one time I was peeing in a park in the city of Kharkov, and a police officer came up to me and was like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Well, I'm clearly peeing." And he's like, "Well, you can't do that. That's against the law." And I'm like, "No, it's not. Everybody pees in parks. I've seen you do it." And he wasn't amused by this. So he's like, "All right, you're going to jail. We're going, I'm taking you into the police station." I'm like, "Oh, fine." This wasn't the first time I'd been taken to jail in Ukraine. So I'm walking with him. And this is kind of indicative of what Ukrainian police officers are often like. And after a little ways, he's like, all right, I'm going to level with you. For $200 American, I'm going to let you go. I'm like, no, man. We're, like I said, I'd been to jail before, so I wasn't afraid of it. All right, $200 American. And I'm like, no. He's like, fine. And so we walk a little bit further. And after a little ways, he's like, all right, $50 American. I'm like, no, still no. We're going to go down to the police station. We're going to do this right. And he's like, in a huff, and we keep walking. After a little while, he's like, $20. I'm like, no. He's like, all right, I'm going to level with you. All I really want is a bottle of vodka. If you buy me a bottle of vodka, I'll let you go. And I'm like, I'm not going to buy you a bottle of vodka. I'll buy you a can of Coke. He's like, oh, fine. So I bought him a can of Coke, and he went on his way.
So you got out of jail for a can of Coke.
Basically, yeah. I guess that falls under comedic.
It does.
Or partially epically meaningful as to how life is lived in Ukraine. All sorts of things happened. I mean, I had to jump from trains on certain days. I was on a plane that the right engine burst into flames. I don't know. It didn't. Strangely enough, I'm not as disturbed by things like that as perhaps other people would be. I remember the first day that happened. The first day I got there, just arriving in from Germany and landed in Kiev, and I was supposed to take another plane to the city of Donetsk, which is now in the midst of a civil war. Wasn't back then, but we get on this it must have been like a 1950s twin turboprop plane that was just in terrible shape, and we're sitting in hammocks basically in the back of the plane, flying across the country. And as the plane's taking off, the right engine bursts into flames and just basically skids to a stop on the runway. And a bunch of Russian guys are running around yelling in Russian that I didn't really speak very well at the time. And eventually, after 2 hours of sitting in the cold, somebody comes in and is like, the plane is not able to fly. And they put us up in a hotel that night and then flew us out of a military airport the next day. You know, I've walked into rooms to see people performing abortions on themselves with coat hangers in that country. Crazy stuff.
Wow.
Yeah. You walk the streets in the wintertime, and because of such a high, percentage of Ukrainians, suffer from alcoholism, you see a lot of people just dead in the streets who got drunk in the night and passed out in the street and froze to death. That's something you saw quite often, especially in the smaller towns, out on the steppe or wherever. And it was something for many Ukrainians that was just like a day-to-day part of life. They'd put a newspaper over their face and just keep going. People would be waiting at a bus stop with a dead person with a newspaper over their face. And the police would get around in like a day or two to collecting the body.
So then let me ask you this. The age that you went there, I mean, what, about 18?
18, 19, yeah.
Yeah. So living for a few years, coming from, Kingston, Ontario.
The suburbs of Canada.
You were telling me about, well, you had just told me about some of the more tragic things you had witnessed
Yeah.
in Ukraine. And
you saw them all the time, though, is the problem. And then your question was, I guess, at 18 years old or 19 years old, when I left from Kingston, Ontario to go there, and that's when we got cut off. I assume you were sort of leading to how was that experience for a suburban kid from Canada who had to go and live in that.
That's partly what I was going to get at, yes.
All right, well, you can finish your question then.
No,
you want to
you go with that.
I don't know. I actually adapted to it pretty quickly. I don't know. Maybe I have a strange personality type that's able to be thrown into various bizarre circumstances and adapt.
I guess where I was going eventually with it is, did the process of having to adapt to that at a relatively formative age perhaps give you the foundation that you needed to be able to then later on professionally as a filmmaker, especially when it comes to shooting documentaries, travel to places that would be outside of many people's comfort zones and be able to just sort of roll with it and fit in and adapt and not overthink it.
I mean, it's hard to quantify anything exactly in that regard, but I mean, there are very few places in the world that I can go anymore and feel that I don't feel out of place, but that I don't feel uncomfortable. You know what I mean? Yeah, I've been everywhere, be it India or be it, islands in the Caribbean or Iceland. Just about everywhere you've gone, between the experience set that I've had, I've felt pretty comfortable. It's actually, some days I wish, the first time I went to Ukraine, or first time when I got there, I just remember feeling everything at first felt so foreign and felt so out of place to what you're used to. Whereas nowadays I'll go to a country that I've never been to before and nothing feels out of place. You feel relatively comfortable there, and some days you actually wish you could go back and experience it again for the first time because you've done it so often. And I think there is something to be said about living in a foreign place like Ukraine for a long time and traveling a lot with your work, because you understand people in different parts of the world interact with each other very differently. They tell stories differently. They do business very differently. And the more you're accustomed to dealing with that sort of thing and seeing that thing done differently than it's done in North America, the more you're not taken aback or, taken by surprise by certain elements and things that might not be normal in North America.
Had you ever, before going to Ukraine, spent any time somewhere that different from life here?
I went to Disney World once.
I don't know if that counts. So in your work as a cinematographer, you've traveled to a lot of interesting places in the world.
I think the last count was 42 countries. On a few occasions, I've filmed in the middle of riots. I've, been stuck in limbo between third world countries. Of all sorts of things. I've been in some of the worst ghettos in the world. The list goes on.
You have conducted interviews on the radio.
I have.
Tell me about that.
Oh, I used to run a radio show on 91.9 FM, The Cave in Kingston. Just a community access station.
The Cave?
That's what it was called, The Cave. It was, the show was Thursday nights at 8 p.m. It was called The Last Word with Steve Whitehead on 91.9 FM. And yeah, it was just talk radio and usually ended with one song or something. And I had a lot of people on the show. I can't even remember all who I had. I had everyone from the people from Brand Van 3000, Sloan, 5440, Tragically Hip, other bands that I can't remember now, and Peter Zosky.
Oh,
Pause that for a second.
Phone ringing.
Yeah. Just get like something from production officers.
Okay, so you were telling me about the
91
radio show, and you interviewed one of the great interviewers.
Peter Zosky, yeah. I did. And I got that because my dad was hosting a function where I think they were giving him an honorary PhD, and he was involved in the committee giving him an honorary PhD. So he convinced him to come on my radio show, which for some reason he was happy to do. I was actually one of the last people to ever interview him before he died, which is interesting. And I prepared a lot of questions based on, research and based on things he said that night. But I don't know if he enjoyed doing it, but he kind of made it his purpose to sort of entirely take the questions in a different way, whereby you'd say, well, how does it feel to have a room full of academics at a university giving you a standing ovation? Which they were, but his response was, well, they weren't giving me a standing ovation. They were giving the CBC and what it's came to mean a standing ovation. So he would never really go with you fully on the pre-prepared questions. And like you were saying earlier, it would often be better just to speak off the cuff with him. The interviewer should be genuinely interested.
Yeah.
Peter Zosky was one of the greatest interviewers because he knew the star of the show on Morningside wasn't him. He knew the star of the show was the guest he had any given time. You get a lot of news anchors today who have some sort of ego trip or something, and they feel like they have to talk a lot and show how smart they are, when in practice they're not. Whereas you look at someone like Peter Zosky, who did over 40,000 interviews in his career, and clearly he understood that the show was about the person, so he was trying to get as much out of that person as he could, which was interesting. And you kind of felt that he was asking the questions that you would want to ask if you were sitting and talking with this person. But when they were shooting 7-Up way back in, I think it was the 60s they first did it, and they're shooting all these kids who were 7-year-olds at school and at home, before they even rolled footage, because back then you couldn't just roll 16mm footage freely because it cost a fortune, they just brought unloaded cameras out in front of these kids for a long time, like days, and just, turned them on so the red light was on so the kids would get used to having it around, and not recording any footage. They just did it to sort of disarm the kids. So after a little while, they just didn't care anymore. And once they felt they didn't care anymore, that's when they actually started putting film in their cameras and shooting material.
You have to acclimatize people to
Sure.
to being interviewed.
I mean, sometimes you don't have the fortune of having enough time with a person to acclimatize them. Quite often when we're shooting documentaries, you're literally in and out, and you have enough time to run in and set up your cameras and roll it and get out. But other times, depending on the project, you get, greater expanses of time to work with a person.
When you're at a dinner party talking to someone, you know that what you're saying isn't being recorded. So if the point that you want to come across is 80% accurate, and you kind of fumble over a few words, or you say something that you didn't quite want to say, you don't worry too much about it.
Sure.
But when you know that it's being committed to,
A timeless
a
medium.
timeless, committed to, in theory, a timeless medium that will live on past yourself, and where untold numbers of people could potentially watch it and associate that content with you.
True. Although most people would never be so lucky, because most people's stories won't live on that long.
Yeah. I mean, that's the problem when you interview someone, let's say a politician.
It's the worst, because everything they say is so calculated, and they're trying to give meaningful sound bites, but I find every time that I've done politicians, and I've done everything from presidents of countries to MPs to whoever, they all just give you sound bites and say a lot of things, but really at the end of the day end up saying nothing. And you come out of a 2-hour interview and you're like, we really got nothing meaningful here. They danced around every question.
Some people you encounter and you come at them with 20 questions, and that's what they're used to. And you say, okay, first question, you ask them something, they give you a concise answer. You go on to your second question, and so on. Some people just, like, you get them going, and they just go.
It depends on the personality of the person. Some people are more prone to talking, and other people don't have as much to say or don't enjoy the process as much. And that's probably where the questions come in, and you probably have to ask a lot of follow-up questions and prod to make that sort of an interview work, I would think.
So we're not stepping through every decade of history, but during your professional career, call it these last 10 years, how have you seen the medium change?
Well, the medium has probably been through the most change in the last 10 years than it ever did at any given period in time. I started on film. I started loading film. I knew what film smelled like in the dark because I got used to smelling different types of stocks in dark rooms, which all had very different sort of scents to them. So you'd know if you're loading the right film into the camera or not. Now, you're shooting on a DSLR, which costs you nothing and requires no prep, and there's something to be said about both. I mean, obviously you have all the purists who talk about film and how film is superior. I'm not sure I agree. In fact, the image quality of higher-end cameras now, I think I would prefer over film stock, in my opinion. Plus, just, you had a lot of filmmakers, too, who were so obsessed for a long time about shooting on film, but didn't have enough money to actually shoot many takes or shoot a lot of variations. And ultimately, despite the fact that at the time they were shooting on a better medium than the highest level of video or digital that was available at the time, they probably ended up with a worse project because they couldn't really explore what they were shooting enough to get enough good footage to create something good. Whereas they would have been better off shooting on something cheaper that wasn't so prohibitive for them and just, explored more, done more takes, and, given the actors more chances to explore the characters in the scene, given the cinematographer more chances to do varieties of coverage, what have you. And yes, perhaps at those times the digital image would have been inferior to the film. The project as a whole probably would have been better, if that makes sense.
That does make sense, and it's an unusual perspective to hear from a cinematographer that takes the image quality so seriously.
We take the image quality seriously, that's our job, but more important than image quality, or the aspect of image quality for our job, is the aspect of storytelling as our job. We're not just image technicians who are just trying to create interesting and pretty images. I've done enough projects that look beautiful but are terrible to know that the more important thing is the experience of the project for the viewer versus the image. That trumps everything else. And if you think differently as a cinematographer, you're hurting the project and everyone you work with. Yes, there has to be a give and take too, by the way. In that regard, I mean, the cinematographer is still I'm not saying the cinematographer just be a pushover and have terrible images all the time. No, your job is to maintain a higher quality or the highest quality you can of image. But you have to understand the entire goal. Because yes, story's more important than image, but story combined with great image will ultimately make the greatest project.
So that little statuette that's sitting there on the table, carefully positioned by moi.
Yeah, I noticed that. This is the Canadian Society of Cinematographers Award for Best Documentary Cinematography.
Okay. Now, that is for the documentary we did together, A People Uncounted. And when we set out to do that documentary, I wouldn't say argued, but we sort of debated the relative merits of different types of camera systems.
We did.
And you won said debate, and I'm very thankful that you won said debate on bringing out what was at the time a pretty shaky beta level Red 1 camera.
Yes, it was.
And a set of prime lenses and a Steadicam, and it was a camera system that took minutes to boot up, an hour to piece together every morning, and required a 3-person crew, of which you led, to operate. That said, at the end of the day, it led to that award there on the table.
I remember Oliver Stapleton telling me I was crazy. He was the DP of, I met him in Poland. Or he's the guy who originally shot Hail Hail Rock and Roll, by the way. And then he also went on to shoot movies like Cider House Rules and stuff like that. Very famous cinematographer. And I was talking to him about the project while I was at Camera Homage in Poland. And I told him I was going to shoot on the Red One, and he told me I was being irresponsible and crazy. And perhaps he was right. But it's a big question, right? Like, I think our debate was whether or not to bring sort of a more classic style E&G camera versus a Red One.
Which was clearly going to produce a better picture, but in a very cumbersome way.
Yes. I mean, that's not to say E&G cameras in some regards aren't cumbersome either.
No, they have
I
their
mean,
own problems.
that was at the time before DSLRs were available. Like, I might have been quite happy to shoot it on like a 5D Mark II if that was available, but it wasn't. And what I was going for wasn't that I was just trying to push for a higher spec camera, which the Red is. That wasn't the part of it that interested me. The style of filmmaking that you embrace when you use a camera like the Red, especially when you use it right, I have, a proper focus puller and proper operator, and the prime lenses that you mentioned, it kind of sets you up to shoot your shots in such a way that everything becomes more deliberate, which will ultimately create a different experience and different story. Because if you can too easily just capture everything, that's the verite style, and there's something to be said about that, capturing off-the-cuff footage, which in many cases will have a very free, loose style. There's also something to be said about approaching things with a more deliberate eye. So the camera is showing, not discovering. There's, an objective camera and a subjective camera. And more than anything, for People Uncounted, my goal of that, I didn't want just another loose off-the-cuff documentary. We just gotten off shooting Material Success, which was very loose, very handheld. We had no idea what was going to happen, and which turned out to be a good film, and that served that film well. But given the places we were going to be going and the people we were going to be dealing with, I thought the cinematic experience of Eastern Europe and many of the other places we went to would create a documentary that sort of set itself apart from a lot of the other documentaries and newsreels that are shot on the subject. And that's what interested me more about the Red with the prime lenses. The prime lenses is another issue you can talk about because
We'd be shooting an interview
and you have to change lenses.
Doing lens changes.
And that takes all of 2-3 minutes, but I mean, it's way slower than just having a zoom lens where you just sort of push in on something and get a different size. What that reminds me of is, like when I first went to university, we both went to Ryerson together, and they still do it to this day, which I think is good. They make you shoot everything on the first year on 16 millimeter, which, is expensive, especially for a film student. So you get 1 or 2 cans of film for a project, and that would give you, 6 minutes of footage because they're 100-foot rolls. And, you had to make a 2-minute film on 6 minutes of footage. So everything you did was much more thought out and meticulous because you couldn't just take a DSLR and shoot everything and then, it's in there somewhere, we'll just cut it together and find something. The exercise was more in the process about thinking about what you're making. And in its own right, that's sort of what the choice of shooting on a Red camera at that time was about. It was more about making deliberate choices as opposed to just hoping everything would land in your lap.
Since we're on the topic of the technicalities of shooting,
okay,
when I set up to do this interview with you, you came into the room and you started suggesting some changes to my lighting setup.
Okay, yeah.
Which I welcomed.
Sure, I mean...
Tell me about what you were trying to accomplish.
We don't have a ton going on here. We just basically have the main source of light in the room is coming from the open window right behind, which is probably all burnt out. Now, what I was doing is, if we turn that light off, all of a sudden it's going to look pretty dark on my face. You might catch a little bit of detail around here because we've got a reflector coming. But this part right here is, right in here is probably pretty dark. Because you've got a 45-degree light wrapping around the back. So what we did is we moved this Kino Flow here to sort of fill up my face. Choink. So you see something. And then if we didn't have this big white fill right here, this side would be just solid black. So yeah, we're doing the best we can with what we got. To think that gear doesn't, or the available technology doesn't affect the form of filmmaking is just blatantly ignorant as to the changes that have happened over the years. I mean, if you look back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you had these massive big cameras with, if you wanted to shoot sound, they had to be blimped, and they weighed literally hundreds of pounds in some cases. So to move them or do anything, you either had to have big dollies or cranes. It was a very slow, cumbersome process that you needed a lot of people.
I think we got an airplane flying by, but let's just keep going.
All right, well, we're not trying to be technically perfect here. This is more about the conversation anyway.
Yeah.
So you have that. So film crews are big, they're slow, everything is very meticulous. But then come the 1960s, companies like, what was it? I believe it was the Eclair. What was it? The Eclair IMO? I think it was the IMO. No, the Camaflex. It was the Camaflex, which came out, which was a 35 millimeter camera that was about yay big. You could hold it in your hand, and you could do whatever you want. It was loud, but who cared? You could do whatever you wanted, and you can trace back the origins of French New Wave cinema to that camera alone. The entire style of how French New Wave cinema was shot, which was very handheld, very off the cuff, very loose, which is a style of cinema, one of the more celebrated styles of cinema that have come out, is entirely thanks to that camera. Because now filmmakers could do, A, they were cheaper, B, you didn't have to have a big crew, C, you could move them in any which way you wanted to, so all of a sudden it freed filmmakers to, like Jean-Luc Godard and Truffaut, up to make films that were much more loose and much more, visceral in many senses. And the same thing is happening again today. Now you've got DSLRs. It is the same equivalent to the Eclair Camaflex. Now anyone can make a film, and for better or worse, it is very democratizing in some senses. Is there a lot of sloppy, terrible work because of it? Yes. But there's also people who do great work. But
and people who might have in the past not had an opportunity to do any work.
But all that aside, whether you think the work's good or bad, it has changed the style that films are made in. Because now all of a sudden the audience is becoming more accustomed to seeing footage more off the cuff. So if you look at even bigger blockbuster films that could afford, to do very clean, polished work, all of a sudden that style has become uninteresting to a lot of viewers. So it's a case of the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, where because that change happened, it affected, the bigger players now have to sort of answer to the style that was generated by, smaller devices. And the Aton comes out, which is a sound silent camera that fits on your shoulder comfortably like a cat. In fact, in the instruction manual of the original Atons, there's a picture of an operator with a cat on his shoulder, just to sort of illustrate the point that it's like a cat on your shoulder.
Tell me about maybe some of your all-time favorite documentaries or ones that you might sort of recommend for people to watch.
Oh, geez. I always have the hardest time answering these sorts of questions.
And I'm focusing specifically on documentaries that would include some form of conversation or interview, even if it's very informal.
One might think that if someone's going to the trouble of watching a podcast about documentaries and the interviewing process, most of the audience probably is fairly literate in terms of documentary.
Pretty versed. They have their finger on the pulse.
I think one of my favorite generally speaking, I don't watch documentaries about current events or politics, for example. Not to say that that's not important, because it is, because quite often documentaries can be more critical and tackle subjects of a political nature in a more sort of unique and unbiased way. That's not true. They're always biased. But
bolder in a bolder way.
Perhaps a bolder way that, say, the news media can't because of various, political influences and corporate ties that news agencies often have.
So you could say maybe documentary filmmakers are not afraid to take risks.
Hopefully
in a way that
not.
A journalist might be kind of afraid to go into certain touch on certain areas.
I think more often than not that's the case. Um, that's not to say that doesn't happen either. But generally speaking, because I read the news a lot, I read the news every day, I'm less interested in seeing documentaries about topics that are widely discussed in the media. Um, so, I mean, I kind of tend to prefer quirky topics of documentary about very unique stories. Or even stories that aren't that unique, because sometimes in the common you find the universal. But I don't know. For example, my favorite documentary that I've seen in a long time was King of Kong, and which is a great story. It's a very bizarre story. It's about this guy who, as a child, dreamed of being a rock star and was a really good drummer, but never made it as a rock star, as a lot of people don't. And then dreamed of being an aerospace engineer, and actually studies aerospace in university, and then gets a job at Boeing. But shortly after being hired for Boeing, is downsized and loses his job as an aerospace engineer, and then just takes a job teaching high school. And there's nothing wrong with being a high school teacher. I come from a family of educators. But he decides he wants to get something right in his life, just one thing meaningful. After everything he's tried has been a failure, he wants to get one thing right. And he chooses the arbitrary goal of being the world champion Donkey Kong player. Oh, I'm not going to tell you how the movie ends, but the characters he comes across are very funny and bizarre and unique, and it's a subculture in the world that one would never think about. And that's the kind of documentary filmmaking I like. Mm-hmm. So,
Now, does that documentary include any sort of formal interviews?
yes, there are several formal interviews in the movie King of Kong. But what's interesting about the movie King of Kong to me is not only the documentary or the interviewing process in that film, but also if you think about it from the standpoint of a filmmaker. Well, I will spoil the movie. The guy does go on to become the world champion Donkey Kong player after he has people break into his garage and
Spoiler alert,
break his machine. It eventually achieves his goal of becoming the world champion Donkey Kong player. But when the documentary filmmakers set out to make the film King of Kong, they had no idea this was going to happen. They were just following this weird guy around. Well, not weird, perhaps in many ways, quite normal, who just chose an arbitrary, bizarre goal. And they had no idea of, the iceberg that they were going to uncover in the process of making this film. So, what for me is the most spectacular thing about that film is the world that it ends up uncovering, unbeknownst to everyone who set out to make the film. Mm-hmm. That, for me, was the most interesting part of it.
It's almost like a lot of great documentaries come from going out on a limb.
Yeah.
What's it like sitting in front of the camera being interviewed?
No, I hate it. Yeah, I've never liked it.
Now, before we did this, you said you did not think you'd be a good interview subject.
I still don't think I am.
But you've had a lot to talk about, and a lot of these questions, I can see the way that you've lit up with ideas of what to say. Is there any question that you think I should have asked you?
Any question that you think you should have asked me? No, I don't know. I wish I had a better answer for you. I really don't. That seems pretty good. That you should have asked me. Why did I allow myself to be interviewed in a wrinkly shirt that I just slept in? When that so annoys me when other people do anything close to that? How's that for a question?